Welcome to a story that's been unfolding for nearly 40 years, but has gone largely untold. And that's the way the central characters wanted it. They were smart and understood something very important, that they might more easily get what they wanted from state capitals than from Washington, D.C. So they started putting their money in places like Raleigh, North Carolina, Nashville, Tennessee, Phoenix, Arizona, and Madison, Wisconsin. That's because what happens in our state legislatures directly affects our taxes, schools, roads, the quality of our air and water, even our right to vote. Politicians and lobbyists at the core of this clever enterprise figured out how to pull it off in an organized, camouflage way, covering their tracks while they put one over on an unsuspecting public. This is the story of how and why it worked. Our report was many months in the making, and it's a collaboration between Tom Casciato and Kathleen Hughes, the filmmakers at Okapi Productions, and the Schumann Media Center that I head. Schumann supports independent journalism and public watchdog groups like the Center for Media and Democracy, whose investigators have been tracking the footprints of ALEC, an organization hiding in plain sight, yet one of the most influential and powerful in American politics.
I've often told people that I talk to out on the campaign trail when they say, state what? When I say I'm running for the state legislature, I tell them that the decisions that are made here in the legislature are often more important for your everyday life than the decisions the president makes.
If you really want to influence the politics of this country, you don't just give money to presidential campaigns. You don't just give money to congressional campaign committees. Smart players put their money in the states.
ALEC has forged a unique partnership between state legislators and leaders from the corporate and business community. This partnership offers businessmen the extraordinary opportunity to apply their talents to solve our nation's problems and build on our opportunities.
I was stunned at the notion that politicians and corporate representatives, corporate lobbyists were actually voting behind closed doors on these changes to the law before they were introduced in state houses across the country.
ALEC has been, I think, a wonderful organization. Not only does it bring like-minded legislators together, but the private sector engagement and partnership in ALEC is really what I think makes it the organization that it is.
You might have heard the name ALEC in the news lately.
The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC for short.
The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC.
ALEC is a nationwide consortium of elected state legislators working side by side with some of America's most powerful corporations. They have an agenda you should know about, a mission to remake America, changing the country by changing its laws, one state at a time. ALEC creates what it calls model legislation, pro-corporate laws like this one that its members push in state houses across the country. ALEC says close to 1,000 bills, based at least in part on its models, are introduced every year, and an average of 200 pass. This has been going on for decades, but somehow ALEC managed to remain the most influential corporate-funded political organization you'd never heard of. Until a gunshot sounded in the Florida night.
Trayvon Martin unarmed, but for a bag of candy and an iced tea that he was carrying.
You'll recall that the shooter in Trayvon Martin's death was protected at first by Florida's so-called Stand Your Ground law. That law was the work of the National Rifle Association. There's its lobbyist standing right beside Governor Jeb Bush when he signed it into law in 2005. Although ALEC didn't originate the Florida law, it seized on it for the Stand Your Ground model it would circulate in other states. 24 of them have passed a version of it.
How did this law not only get in place in Florida, but around the country? And all the fingers kept pointing back to ALEC.
When civil rights and grassroots groups learned about ALEC's connection to Stand Your Ground laws, they were outraged.
ALEC doesn't do its work alone. They do it with some of the biggest corporate brands in America.
Before long, corporations were pulling out of ALEC, including Coca-Cola, Kraft Foods, McDonald's, Mars, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson. Caught in the glare of the national spotlight, ALEC tried to change the subject.
You know, I think the entire debate needs to be reframed, and really what ALEC is a bipartisan association of state legislators. We have, you know, legislators of all political stripes coming together to talk about the most critical issues facing the states and trying to come up with the best solutions to face some of the problems
so
we're
your
having.
point is it's not a partisan organization.
But ALEC is partisan, and then some.
In the spring, I got a call from a person who said that all of the ALEC bills were available and was I interested in looking at them. And I said I was.
Lisa Graves, a former Justice Department lawyer, runs the Center for Media and Democracy. That's a nonprofit investigative reporting group in Madison, Wisconsin. In 2011, by way of an ALEC insider, Graves got her hands on a virtual library of internal ALEC documents. She was amazed by its contents, a treasure trove of actual ALEC model bills.
These are the bills that were provided by the whistleblower. That's just the index.
There were more than 850 of them. 850 boilerplate laws that ALEC legislators could introduce as their own in any state in the union.
Bills to change the law to make it harder for American citizens to vote, those were ALEC bills. Bills to dramatically change the rights of Americans who are killed or injured by corporations, those were ALEC bills. Bills to make it harder for unions to do their work were ALEC bills. Bills to basically block climate change agreements, those were ALEC bills. When I looked at them, I was really shocked. I didn't know how incredibly extensive and deep and far-reaching this effort to rework our laws was.
She and her team began to plow through ALEC's documents, as well as public sources, to compile a list of the organizations and people who were or had been ALEC members. They found hundreds of corporations from Coca-Cola and Coke Industries to ExxonMobil, Pfizer, and Walmart. Dozens of right-wing think tanks and foundations. 24 corporate law firms and lobbying firms. And some 1,000 state legislators, a few of them Democrats, the majority of them Republican.
ALEC is a corporate dating service for lonely legislators and corporate special interests that eventually the relationship culminates with some special interest legislation, and hopefully that lives happily ever after is the ALEC model. Unfortunately, what's excluded from that equation is the public.
In the Wisconsin State House, Democratic Representative Mark Pocan is trying to expose ALEC's fingerprints whenever he can. By one count, over a third of Pocan's fellow Wisconsin lawmakers are ALEC members.
When you look around, especially on the Republican side of the aisle, a lot of members of ALEC. Front row, ALEC. When you start going down to the chair of finance and some of the other members are all ALEC members. In fact, ALEC co-chair for the state. Row by row, you can point out people who've been members of ALEC over the years. There's two main categories they have. One is how to reduce the size of government, and the other half of it is this model legislation that's in the corporate good. In other words, there's profit-driven legislation. How can you open up a new market? How can you privatize something that can open up a market for a company? And between those two divisions, you're kind of getting to the same end goal, which is really kind of ultimate privatization of everything.
Mark Pocan is something of an expert on ALEC. In fact, to learn as much as he could, he became a member.
What I'd realize is if you join ALEC for a mere $100 as a legislator, you have the full access like any corporate member.
He also took himself to an ALEC conference for a first-hand look.
Hi, I'm State Representative Mark Pocan, and welcome to my video blog. I'm outside of the Marriott on Canal Street in New Orleans at the ALEC convention, the American Legislative Exchange Council. That was where you watch the interaction of a room full of lobbyists. You know, free drinks, free cigars, whining, dining. Many people just came from a dinner that was sponsored by some special interest, coming to a party that's sponsored by a special interest, so they can continue to talk about special interest.
This is from the New Orleans Convention. This includes a number of seminars that they held for legislators, including one called Warming Up to Climate Change, the many benefits of increased atmospheric CO2.
That 2011 ALEC conference, lo and behold, was sponsored by BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Shell, among others. Another of its events featured guns.
This is the NRA-sponsored shooting event for legislators and for lobbyists, free.
There was even one offering free cigars.
Sponsored by Reynolds American, which is one of the biggest tobacco companies in the world, and the Cigar Association of America.
It sounds like lobbying. It looks like lobbying. It smells like lobbying. But ALEC says it's not lobbying. In fact, ALEC operates not as a lobby group, but as a nonprofit, a charity. In its filing with the IRS, ALEC says its mission is education, which means it pays no taxes and its corporate members get a tax write-off. Its legislators get a lot too.
In Wisconsin, I can't take anything of value from a lobbyist. I can't take a cup of coffee from a lobbyist. At ALEC, it's just the opposite. You know, you get there and you're being wined and dined by corporate interests. I can go down there and be wined and dined for days in order to hear about their special legislation. I mean, the head of Shell Oil flew in on his private jet to come to this conference. The head of one of the largest utility companies in the country was there on a panel, a utility company in 13 states, and here he is presenting to legislators. I mean, they clearly brought in some of the biggest corporate names in special interestdom and had them meeting with legislators because a lot of business transpires at these events.
The most important business happens in what ALEC calls task forces. There are currently 8 of them, with a corporate take on every important issue in American life, from health and safety to the environment to taxation. In ALEC task forces, elected state officials and corporate representatives close the doors to press and public, and together approve the bills that will be sent out to America. But Americans have no idea they come from ALEC unless someone like a Mark Pocan exposes it.
When I went down to New Orleans to the ALEC convention last August, I remember going to a workshop and hearing a little bit about a bill they did in Florida and some other states. And there was a proposal to provide special needs scholarships. And lo and behold, all of a sudden I come back to Wisconsin, and what gets introduced? Get ready, I know you're going to have shock look on your face. A bill to do just that.
26 ALEC members in the Wisconsin legislature sponsored that special needs bill, but the real sponsor was ALEC. Pocan knew because the bill bore a striking resemblance to ALEC's model. Have a look. But Pocan isn't only concerned that ALEC sneaks bills into the state legislature. The intent behind the bills troubles him too.
Some of their legislation sounds so innocuous, but when you start to read about why they're doing it, you know there's a far different reason why something's coming forward, and that's important. If the average person knew that a bill like this came from some group like ALEC, you look at the bill very differently, and you might look at that legislator a little differently about why they introduced it. This is not about education. This is not about helping kids with special needs. This is about privatization. This is about corporate profits. And this is about dismantling public education.
The bill passed in the Wisconsin House, but failed to make it through the Senate. However, in its education report card, ALEC boasts that similar bills have passed in Oklahoma, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Ohio. ALEC's education agenda includes online schooling as well. Take a careful look, and you'll find the profit motive there too.
What you see is corporations that have a direct benefit, whose bottom line directly benefits from these bills, voting on these bills in the ALEC task force. And so corporations like Connections Academy, corporations like K-12, they have a direct financial interest in advancing this agenda.
Those corporations, Connections Academy and K-12, which specialize in online education, can profit handsomely from laws that direct taxpayer money toward businesses like theirs. In 2011, both sat on ALEC's Education Task Force. But the two companies didn't just approve the model bill, they helped craft it. The proof is in one of ALEC's own documents. And there's more to the story.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Bill 1030 has to do with the establishment of virtual public schools.
Last year, an online schooling bill based on the ALEC model turned up in another state where ALEC has a powerful influence, Tennessee. It was introduced in both the state Senate and House by ALEC members. The bill passed, making private corporations eligible for public money for online education. Then, within weeks, the K-12 corporation got what amounted to a no-bid contract to provide online education to any Tennessee student from kindergarten through the 8th grade. So let's review. The ALEC member corporations helped craft the bill. ALEC legislators introduce it and vote on it, and now there's a state law on the books that enables one of those corporations to get state money. Game, set, match. But remember, this story isn't about one company in the education industry and one law in Tennessee. It's about hundreds of corporations in most every industry, influencing lawmakers in state after state using ALEC as a front. Here's another example. The American Bail Coalition, which represents the bail bond industry, pulls no punches about writing ALEC's model bills itself. In a newsletter a few years back, the coalition boasted that it had written 12 ALEC model bills fortifying the commercial bail industry. Here's Jerry Watson, senior legal counsel for the coalition, speaking at an ALEC meeting in 2007. He has a law to offer.
There is a model bill for you to review if you might be interested in introducing such a measure.
He'll even help legislators amend it.
Now, if you don't like the precise language of these suggested documents, can they be tweaked by your legislative council? Well, absolutely. And will we work with them on that and work with you and your staff on that? Absolutely.
All the lawmakers have to do is ring him up.
There is a phone number there for our executive offices in Washington, D.C. We're prepared to help you and your staff and support this legislation in any way that we can.
And guess what? There's gold at the end of the rainbow.
But I'm not so crazy as not to know that you've already figured out that if I can talk you into doing this bill, my clients are going to make some money on the bond premiums.
And corporate interest conflated with the public interest.
If we can help you save crime victims in your legislative district and generate positive revenue for your state and help solve your prison overcrowding problem, you don't mind me making $1.
ALEC members are seldom as upfront as the American Bail Coalition. In fact, ordinarily ALEC's hand is very hard to see at all. But if you know where to look, you'll often find ALEC hiding in plain sight.
ALEC has, in addition to its regular vacation resort trips, it also has special, what it calls boot camps on particular substantive issues.
In March 2011, ALEC held one of those boot camps for legislators at the North Carolina Capitol in Raleigh. The subject was so-called tort reform, how to keep the average Joe from successfully suing a corporation for damages. The day after the boot camp, 2 state representatives presented the draft version of a House bill chock full of ALEC priorities. It would, among other things, limit corporate product liability in North Carolina. One of the representatives, Jonathan Ryan, was quoted in the Raleigh News-Observer saying of ALEC, "I really don't know much about them." That's odd, because Ryan had been listed as a featured speaker at the ALEC Tort Reform Boot Camp. The paper also reported that Ryan said the bill wasn't copied from ALEC model legislation. That too is odd, given how the sections covering product liability could have passed as twins. The bill was controversial. It passed, but only after the product liability sections were taken out of it. But the tort reformers didn't give up. They were back a year later, this time with a draft bill aimed specifically to limit the liability of drug manufacturers. When the public was allowed to comment before a legislative panel, people who had lost loved ones came to testify against the bill. A son who had lost a father.
You know, my dad's gone. All I can do is sit here and be a voice for him. He can't speak any longer. Emotional and
a grandfather mourning his granddaughter.
If this bill passes, an innocent victim in North Carolina, like Brittany, could not hold a manufacturer accountable. Everyone needs to be accountable for their actions.
Unmentioned to those in the room, ALEC was present too, in the form of a lobbyist with drug manufacturing giant GlaxoSmithKline. His name is John Del Giorno.
Several of the opposing testifiers today brought up very compelling, sad, empathetic stories about...
Not only is Glaxo an ALEC corporate member, Del Giorno himself is also a vice chairman of ALEC's National Private Enterprise Board. The North Carolina bill has been tabled for now. So now you've seen how it works for corporations. How about for the politicians?
Last night was, as the president finally acknowledged today, a shellacking. Republicans gained control of the House, picking up 60 seats so far.
When all of the returns were counted on election night 2010, ALEC was a big winner. 8 of the Republican governors elected or re-elected that night had ties to the group.
Guess what? I'm going to be governor of Ohio!
There's going to be a lot of news and a lot of observers that say that we made history.
A clean sweep for Republicans.
And a star was born that election night. Wisconsin's new governor, a son of ALEC named Scott Walker.
Wisconsin is open for business.
I've known Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, for the better part of 20 years. And Scott is a classic career politician. I don't say that in a negative way.
Journalist and Wisconsinite John Nichols has tracked Scott Walker's career since the 90s, when Walker was a state legislator and an ALEC member.
And in 2010, he ran not presenting himself as an ALEC alumni or as an ally of big corporations or big business people outside the state. He ran a very down-home campaign.
This is my lunch. I pack a brown bag each day so I can save some money to spend on, the more important things in life, like sending my kids to college.
Nichols says that despite the folksy image, in the years leading up to Walker's 2010 campaign, he had become a master political fundraiser.
And he began to really forge incredibly close ties with a lot of corporate interests that he had first been introduced to in ALEC, individuals and groups like the Koch brothers.
David and Charles Koch, the billionaire businessmen behind a vast industrial empire, are also political activists with an agenda. Their companies and foundations have been ALEC members and funders for years.
The Koch brothers were among the 2 or 3 largest contributors to Scott Walker's campaign for governor of Wisconsin. And the Koch brothers get that if you really want to influence the politics of this country, you don't just give money to presidential campaigns. You don't just give money to congressional campaign committees. The smart ones, the smart players, put their money in the states.
Hi, I'm Scott Walker.
It's state government that funds education, social services, and it taxes.
If you want lower taxes and less government, I'm Scott Walker, and I know how to get the job done.
And so the smart donors can change the whole country without ever going to Washington, without ever having to go through a congressional hearing, without ever having to lobby on Capitol Hill, without ever having to talk to a president.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
The new governor moved quickly with a raft of ALEC-inspired bills. They included one similar to Florida's Stand Your Ground. Another made it easier to carry concealed weapons. There was a resolution opposing the mandated purchase of health insurance, and of course, there was one limiting corporate liability. The Wisconsin legislature passed a so-called tort reform measure that included parts of 8 different ALEC models. ALEC was elated, praising Walker and the legislature in a press release for their, quote, immediate attention to reforming the state's legal system. But Scott Walker was also shooting for another big ALEC prize.
Now, some have questioned why we have to reform collective bargaining.
Taking away workers' collective bargaining rights. That had long been an ALEC goal. A candid video caught Scott Walker talking about it with one of his financial backers, the billionaire businesswoman Diane Hendricks.
We're going to start in a couple of weeks with our budget adjustment bill. The first step is we're going to deal with collective bargaining for all public employee unions, because you divide and conquer.
Despite an extraordinary public outcry,
This is not just a rule.
and after a brief but intense political struggle, Walker's anti-collective bargaining measures became state law.
It was ALEC's ideas, ALEC's values that permeated the bill and undid almost 50 years, more than 50 years, of collective bargaining law in Wisconsin.
But again, remember, this isn't just about one state. It's about every state. Take Arizona. It's practically an ALEC subsidiary. One report this year found that 49 of the state's 90 legislators are members, and 2/3 of the Republican leadership are on ALEC task forces. And of course, the governor, Jan Brewer, was an ALEC member too. So, not surprising, Arizona is among the states passing ALEC-inspired laws to privatize education at taxpayer expense. And no surprise again, Arizona is also getting ALEC-like laws to limit corporate liability.
Police will also be able to ask anyone to prove their legal status.
And Arizona, you'll recall, made news in 2010 with a law allowing police to stop someone for looking Hispanic and detaining them if they weren't carrying proper papers. Laws that create more arrests can create more revenue for-profit prison companies. So it probably won't shock you to learn that Arizona's immigration law also inspired an ALEC model, a version of which was passed in 5 other states.
All of us here are very familiar with ALEC and the influence that ALEC has with many of the members here.
ALEC's domination of Arizona proved too much for State Representative Steve Farley.
I just want to emphasize, it's fine for corporations to be involved in this process. Corporations have the right to present their arguments, but they don't have the right to do it secretly. They don't have the right to lobby people and not register as lobbyists. They don't have the right to take people away on trips, convince them of them, send them back here, and then nobody's seen what's really going on and how that legislator has gotten that idea and where is it coming from.
Farley has introduced a bill to force legislators to disclose their ALEC ties, just as the law already requires them to do with any lobbyist.
All I'm asking in the ALEC Accountability Act is to make sure that all of those expenses are reported as if they are lobbying expenses, and all those gifts that legislators received are reported as if they're receiving the gifts from lobbyists. So the public can find out and make up their own minds about who's influencing what.
Steve Farley's bill has gone nowhere. ALEC, on the other hand, is still everywhere, still hiding in plain sight. Watch for it, coming soon to a state house near you. In reporting this story, we wanted to talk to ALEC and some of its legislative members, as well as to some of its former corporate members. Our requests were either turned down or went unanswered. At one point, we were told that the chairman of ALEC had agreed to an interview. We pursued it, but never received a response. Meanwhile, ALEC continues to make news. You've heard about all those bills passed in state after state by Republican legislatures to prevent people from voting unless they can produce a government-issued photo ID. Many of those voter ID laws are based in part on, you guessed it, an ALEC model bill. As you saw in our report, such groups as Color of Change have questioned whether ALEC is an organization with which businesses want to be associated. So far, about 40 corporations have decided their answer is no thanks and pulled out of ALEC. Still, many companies remain ALEC members, and ALEC continues to strengthen its ties to conservatives. Earlier this month, ALEC held a high-level, closed-door meeting with congressional conservatives in the nation's capital. The watchdog group Common Cause has filed a complaint asking the IRS to end ALEC's tax-exempt status and force it to register instead as a high-powered lobby. Many legislators would then have to tell their constituents what they've mostly been able to hide up until now, that via ALEC, They've been wined and dined by high-powered corporate lobbyists who took a hand in shaping laws in the state where you live. Here's an example of what's at stake. The American Chemistry Council, that's the trade group for the chemical industry, has used ALEC to press for changes in health and safety rules on toxic chemicals. Earlier this year, the council poured nearly $650,000 into supporting Wisconsin Republican Tommy Thompson's bid for the U.S. Senate this November.
The American Chemistry Council is responsible for the content of this advertising.
By now, it won't surprise you to learn that Wisconsin's former governor has been a friend of ALEC going all the way back to his days as a state legislator, when he himself was an ALEC member. Take a listen to a speech Thompson made at an ALEC conference in 2002.
Myself, I always loved to go to these meetings because I always found new ideas. And then I'd take them back to Wisconsin, disguise them a little bit, and declare that it's mine.
Ah, yes, Tommy Thompson and so many others. Finally, ALEC meet Alice. That's right, ALEC now has some competition. Inspired by Professor Joel Rogers, the Wisconsin champion of open democracy, Alice is a transparent, non-corporate, out in the open, web-based library of model laws on a range of public interest issues. Alice doesn't have corporate or billionaire backers. The work is done by volunteers. So in the constant struggle for democracy, it's still David versus Goliath. But as you'll remember from that ancient story, the giant doesn't always win.